Some moments don't raise their voices, they wait in silence. Harrison Ford hadn't worn a uniform in decades, but one morning, beneath the June sun at Arlington, he stood before a name that never left him. Then a voice behind him barked a command. Loud, public, demanding. It came from a former president, but Ford didn't turn. He didn't blink, because the answer had already been given long before the cameras ever rolled. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning had been quiet, not silent, quiet. The kind of reverent stillness that only settles over places where names outnumber voices, where flags line the walkways not as decoration, but as testimony. At Arlington National Cemetery, rows of black suits and dress blues had taken their places. A Marine quartet played low and steady. The press was positioned. The president's motorcade had just rolled in. And then, before the formalities could begin, Donald Trump spotted him. He was standing alone. No security detail, no press handler, no entourage. Just Harrison Ford, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed on a granite slab that bore one name among thousands, Lieutenant Christopher Ford, his father, a Navy veteran, a man most of the crowd had never heard of, but whose name was etched into Harrison's bones the same way it was now etched into that wall. Trump squinted, took 2 steps forward, then motioned broadly with one hand, his voice cutting through the air like a microphone turned up just a notch too loud. "You're a legend, Ford, and you're on federal ground. Salute your commander-in-chief." The sentence hit the space like a dropped glass. Reporters stiffened. A few phones raised, fingers trembling just slightly. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the Marine quartet faltered on a note before falling silent. Somewhere near the back, a child whispered, "Is that really Indiana Jones?" Ford didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't give the cameras so much as a blink. He stood 12 feet from Trump, his boots rooted in the walkway like he'd grown out of the ground itself. He wasn't in uniform, but he might as well have been. The way he held himself, shoulders relaxed but steady, chin level, one hand gently resting at his side, spoke of decades shaped not by film sets but by something older, something quieter. Trump adjusted the knot on his red tie and smiled again. "Bigger this time, show ya, but there was something brittle in it. I've always respected you, Harrison," he continued, as the cameras angled in, catching the light just right. "I mean, come on, who doesn't? Real patriot. Real American, but even patriots follow orders." Ford didn't respond, not with words, not with posture, not with even the barest tilt of his head. The crowd had started to shift now, not loudly, not obviously, but collectively. A ripple, heads turned, not toward Trump, but toward the man who still hadn't moved, toward the man whose presence seemed to pull the sound out of the air like gravity. No one quite remembered when he'd arrived. There was no footage of his entrance, no interview, no press alert, just the fact that somehow Harrison Ford had been standing at that wall long before the flags went up and the podiums were placed, long before the speeches, long before Trump. And that was the twist. Trump thought he had walked into a performance. He thought this was his scene to own, to dominate, to choreograph. But Harrison Ford wasn't playing a part. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a prop in someone else's spotlight. He was a son, and he was already home. Trump took a step closer. His shoes tapped against the stone path, a sound small but sharp in the silence. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the memorial, but the air felt colder somehow. The flags no longer moved. Even the breeze, which moments ago had stirred gently among the trees, seemed to pause like the world itself was holding its breath. "I could make this an order, you understand that?" His voice had dropped in pitch, trading its usual bravado for something more pointed, less performative, more commanding. The kind of tone used not in front of crowds, but behind closed doors when power expects obedience. He squared his shoulders, waiting for a reaction. Harrison Ford gave him none. His hand remained on the wall, fingers brushing faintly against the engraved name. Christopher Ford, Lieutenant, Father. The name didn't shimmer, it didn't glow. It just sat there in the stone, carved and quiet, like the man standing in front of it. Trump shifted his weight, the motion betraying a flicker of discomfort. He glanced briefly toward the cameras, then back at Ford. The crowd was still watching, still silent. But something had begun to change. Not loudly, not obviously, but undeniably. A journalist near the press line leaned in and whispered to the person beside her. "He's not ignoring him," she said. "He's already honoring someone." The other nodded but said nothing. A boy in a blue rock uniform lowered his phone, uncertain. He had started filming when Trump raised his voice, expecting something newsworthy. Now he just stood there, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Trump looked around, his smile fading. The silence wasn't working in his favor. It wasn't neutral anymore. It had chosen a side. He tried again. I've had generals salute me in France, in Israel, at the Pentagon. You know that. You've seen the footage. So what's the problem here? Still Ford didn't turn. The sound of a throat clearing came from the press pool, followed by the subtle clink of a camera lens being lowered. Another followed, then another. Reporters weren't reaching for microphones now. They were watching, not Trump, Ford, not for what he'd say, but for what he wouldn't. A woman in the crowd, older, holding a small bouquet of poppies, placed a hand over her heart. She didn't know Ford personally, hadn't even realized it was him at first, but something in his stillness had called to her. Trump exhaled sharply, almost a sigh. "You're standing on federal ground," he repeated, louder this time. "You want to make a scene, Ford. This is how you want to be remembered." But the scene wasn't his anymore. Not really. It was the tension between volume and silence, between a man trying to be seen and one refusing to perform, between a voice demanding attention and a presence that commanded it without sound. Trump took one more step forward, bridging the final few feet between them. The cameras leaned in. The press adjusted. But Ford didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't speak. He was already somewhere else, not physically but in purpose. The crowd began to shift again, heads turned, arms lowered, phones dropped. People weren't responding to a command. They were responding to a man who stood not for himself, but for someone who no longer could. And the twist was this: Trump thought silence was defiance. But what he failed to understand, what the crowd was just beginning to feel, was that silence, when held with dignity, when rooted in memory, can speak louder than any demand ever could. Long before the cameras turned toward him, before the headlines called him a legend, before the world knew him as Indiana Jones or Han Solo, Harrison Ford was just a quiet philosophy student at Ripon College who didn't know exactly what he wanted to be. He wasn't chasing the spotlight. He never did. The applause that would later echo across theaters and red carpets wasn't something he sought. It just found him along the way. What he wanted, what he carried even then, was something quieter, a kind of integrity that didn't need to be named. After college, he worked as a carpenter, not out of failure, not out of desperation, out of choice. He built cabinets for studios and furniture for neighbors. He showed up early, left late. Said little, worked with his hands. There was no agent, no plan, no dream of stardom. Acting came by accident, a line read for someone else, a presence that couldn't be taught. And yet, even when the world started recognizing his face, he never chased the recognition. While others rehearsed their sound bites, he stayed silent. While others negotiated entourages, he flew himself to set. And when the cameras turned off, Ford didn't perform for crowds. He disappeared into the mountains, into sky, into purpose. He learned to fly because it made him feel useful, not powerful, useful. He flew solo rescue missions in the Rockies, not for film, not for charity PR, but because someone needed help and he had the skill. In Wyoming, a 13-year-old girl went missing on horseback. Days passed. Storms rolled in. Search teams thinned out. Then Harrison Ford landed his Bell 407 helicopter in the clearing where her scent had last been tracked. No security, no crew, just Ford. He brought her back. She didn't know who he was at first. To her, he wasn't a movie star. He was a man who had shown up when no one else could. In Arizona, a small Navajo community had lost its mobile clinic due to funding cuts. The nearest medical help was hours away. No announcement was made. No ribbon cut. But within weeks, construction began again, quietly, paid for by an anonymous donor. Years later, a tribal elder would reveal the truth. A man with quiet eyes sent someone to build it. He didn't want his name on it. He wanted us to have it. That was Ford. He didn't tweet it. He didn't film it. He just did it, not for image, for meaning. These weren't random acts. They were continuity. They were a through line that began long before the applause. A promise kept not to the public, but to a father. Christopher Ford had worn the uniform of the U.S. Navy. He had served in World War II. He came home quiet, like many veterans did. He didn't speak much about the war, but he taught his son what mattered. That respect wasn't given with a salute. It was earned in silence. That being seen wasn't the goal. Being of service was, and Harrison remembered. He remembered when the lights came, when the scripts flooded in, when the press leaned in, hungry. He remembered his father's hands, calloused, tired, steady. He remembered the one lesson that stuck deeper than the rest: don't chase being honored. Honor something worth standing for. So when he stood at that wall, in that heat, in that silence, it wasn't a stance. It was a vow, a returning. He wasn't blocking out a president. He was holding space for a name, for a memory. For a man who had once told him, "One day you'll be known. Just don't let that erase what you know is right." That's why he didn't move, not because he didn't hear Trump, but because he was already answering someone else. Trump lifted his arms wide, voice rising with it, searching for a response he was no longer getting. I've been saluted in Israel, in NATO, by generals, heads of state, even Hollywood's finest, he said, throwing a glance toward the nearest camera. But this guy can't even lift a hand. He let the question hang in the air, expecting a ripple of laughter or at least a murmur of agreement. There was none. One camerawoman sighed, stepped back, and let her lens fall from her shoulder. Another reporter, mid-sentence in a live commentary, paused, removed his earpiece, and didn't replace it. A junior staffer from a local station blinked hard, then slowly turned his rig away from the podium, re-aiming it at the man who still hadn't moved. Forward. He hadn't budged an inch, still facing the wall, still resting one hand gently on the name that grounded him, still standing as if nothing, no demand, no title, no microphone, had the right to interrupt what he was remembering. Trump laughed again, louder this time, forced. Come on, Harrison, you've saluted presidents before. Reagan, Bush, Clinton even got a nod. His voice cracked slightly on the last name. You really gonna hold out now? Silence answered him, not just from Ford, from the crowd, from the press, from the air itself. A little girl standing between her parents near the second row looked up. Her voice was soft, but in the hush it carried. Why won't he salute? Her father, in a worn Army Reserve jacket, crouched beside her. He didn't answer right away, just stared ahead at Ford. Then finally, quietly, he said, because he's saluting something higher. Didn't hear them, but the moment rippled anyway. One by one, subtle shifts began to spread. A producer turned to her assistant and whispered, cut to crowd. The assistant shook her head. No, stay on him. And she pointed not at Trump, at Ford. On the memorial steps, a Marine major crossed her arms, her gaze unmoved. Behind her, a high school student in band uniform lowered his trumpet. A mother pulled her child closer, not out of fear, but instinct. Trump tried again, gesturing to the cameras now. Let's be clear here, I'm not asking for much. I just want a little respect. That's not too hard, right? His hands moved like a man used to directing applause. But now there was no echo, no feedback, just the soft creak of someone shifting on the granite benches. Just breathe. A White House photographer stepped back from her mark. She adjusted her zoom lens, aimed again, not at the podium, at the wall, at the hand resting on it, at the shadow cast by a man who refused to shift. Trump's voice faltered. This isn't disrespect. It's just weird, okay? He chuckled to himself, but it was the kind of laugh that dies quickly. He looked around, searching for an ally, for a nod, for even a glance of agreement. But they were watching someone else now. They weren't watching the man speaking. They were watching the man standing. Ford didn't know he was becoming the center of gravity. He wasn't trying to be. He hadn't dressed for cameras. He hadn't prepared a statement. He hadn't even told anyone he'd be attending. He came early, quiet, alone. He stood because he needed to, because today wasn't about presence. It was about remembrance. Trump, for all his volume, had missed the shift. He was still playing to a stage that had turned away from him, still delivering lines to an audience that was no longer there. And the twist, the painful, quiet twist, was that no one had taken that attention from him. He had simply lost it. Because somewhere between the noise and the memory, the crowd had remembered why they came. And it wasn't for him. It started with a breath, not a word, not a gesture. Just the sound of someone drawing air through their nose like they were trying to hold something back. And then a shuffle, the soft drag of a foot against stone. A veteran in the third row, seated in a collapsible chair, stiffened his spine. His right leg ended at the knee, replaced with polished metal. His left leg trembled as he tried to push himself up. No one helped him, not out of disrespect, out of understanding. He wasn't asking, he was rising. Near the front, a girl in a red dress, no more than 8 years old, placed her tiny hand over her chest. Her fingers weren't quite straight, her posture wobbled, but she held the pose anyway. Her grandfather noticed. He didn't speak. He just followed, slower, with a quiet nod. A young mother removed one earbud, then the other. Her phone had been live-streaming the ceremony for her husband, deployed overseas. But now she stopped recording. She slipped the phone into her purse and took her son's hand. The child looked up at her, confused for a second, then mirrored her without question. One by one, the silence spread, not as command, not as choreography, but as instinct. A shared awareness moving through bodies like wind moves through tall grass. There was no signal, no cue, just one still figure standing beside a name, and hundreds of others turning toward that stillness. A high school band member, holding his trumpet in loose fingers, slowly lowered it. Another student placed her clarinet at her side, eyes locked on Ford. No one whispered, no one fidgeted. Even the restless began to still. A man in a wheelchair reached up and removed his cap, not with flourish but with care. He held it against his chest, lips pressed into a line, his eyes glassy. Somewhere near the back, a couple paused mid-conversation. They had been scrolling through photos on their phone, comparing schedules, trying to beat the heat. But now they were frozen, heads turned toward the wall, toward the hand, toward the presence. Not everyone recognized Ford at first. Not everyone needed to. It wasn't about the man. It was about what he represented in that moment, what he refused to give up. He wasn't drawing attention. He was drawing memory, drawing silence, drawing presence. And the silence answered him. Two teenagers, one black, one white, stood side by side near the edge of the reflecting pool. Both had been recording on their phones. They now let their arms fall. No words, no push notification more important than what they were seeing. One whispered, "He's not speaking, but it feels louder than anything." In the press pit, a producer tapped her assistant on the shoulder. "We're losing the shot," she muttered. The assistant didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on Ford. She whispered back, "No, we're finding it." Across the field of people, things began to happen that no one directed. Sunglasses came off. Flags were pressed gently against hearts. Arms lowered. Phones slipped into pockets. A firefighter in dress blues blinked away tears he hadn't expected to feel. A man with a service dog removed his glove and touched the fur on the dog's neck, grounding himself. And in the middle of it all, Harrison Ford hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't raised a hand or bowed his head. He simply remained, one hand on the granite, one presence holding the silence like a sacred object. Trump had gone quiet now. He stood slightly to the side, watching as the crowd shifted without him. The power he'd tried to summon had slipped through his grasp. No one booed, no one shouted, but he could feel it. The temperature of the moment no longer belonged to him. At the far edge of the crowd, a retired Navy officer straightened her posture. She hadn't stood in over 20 minutes. But now, as her cane trembled beneath her hand, she rose slowly, deliberately, and faced the wall. And still, Ford didn't react, because he didn't need to. That was the twist. That was the ache. That was the truth behind the silence. He wasn't performing. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't teaching anyone a lesson. He was standing still for someone who couldn't. And because of that, the crowd, without knowing it, began standing with him. Trump's voice cracked the air like a whip, loud and sharp, cutting across the memorial with raw, frustrated energy. "You salute your president." The words echoed off stone and silence, bounced against folded flags and empty podiums, startled a few birds from the trees above. It was the loudest thing anyone had heard all day, and somehow the most hollow. People flinched, not from fear, from the violence of timing, because the moment had long since shifted. The volume no longer matched the room. It felt like shouting during a funeral, like clapping at a graveside. The crowd held still, stunned not by the power of the order, but by how misplaced it was. And for the first time, even Trump looked unsure. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes darted sideways, the weight of his own voice hung heavy in the space, unanswered. And then, after what felt like hours compressed into seconds, Harrison Ford moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. It was subtle, deliberate, final. His right hand, which had been resting by his side, lifted slowly, crossing his chest with a kind of reverence that didn't belong to ceremony but to memory. His palm pressed flat against his heart, not as a symbol, not as protest, but as a human gesture. Quiet, grounded, personal. His head tilted forward just slightly, gaze locked not on Trump, not on the crowd, not on the sea of lenses now zooming in, but on the wall, on one name, Christopher Ford. For a breathless moment, no one moved, no camera clicked, no whisper passed. It was as if the entire space had paused, waiting for something none of them could name. And then Ford spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried not by volume but by weight. "I don't salute attention," he said. "I honor sacrifice." 7 words. They didn't hit like a speech. They landed like a stone in still water, rippling through every chest, bouncing in every ribcage, then sinking deep and staying there. There was no follow-up, no explanation, no gesture, no gaze toward the man standing feet away. Ford didn't turn, didn't shift. He just let the words hang, untouched and unaccompanied, because some things only ring true when left alone. A cameraman lowered his rig. Another forgot to breathe. A teenage boy standing beside his grandfather whispered, "That's Indiana Jones, but he just became my grandfather." The old man didn't answer. He couldn't, because something had changed. The statement wasn't defiant. It wasn't political. It was principled. It drew a line not between two men, but between two ways of standing in the world. One demanded acknowledgement. The other gave it. One craved attention. The other bore witness. Trump's mouth opened again, ready to reply. But nothing came out. What do you say to a sentence like that? What words can follow that kind of silence? He looked around, but the eyes that met his were no longer searching for leadership. They were holding something else now, something older, something sacred. And in that sacred space, noise had no footing. A young girl held her hand over her chest, mirroring Ford. A Marine in dress blues adjusted his cover and stood straighter, near the back. A reporter folded her notepad and simply watched. The usual urge to document, to comment, to capture, it was gone, because what had just happened wasn't content, it was clarity. The press secretary leaned toward the main network producer and muttered, "Do we cut the feed?" The producer shook his head. "No, this is the story." But Ford didn't care if anyone was filming. He wasn't speaking for the country or for the press or for the president. He was speaking for the name beneath his hand, for the man who never came home, for the father who once told him that service meant showing up even when no one saw you. And that's exactly what Ford had done. He had shown up early, alone, no suit, no announcement, just a man with a memory and the discipline to guard it. His sentence wasn't aimed, it was placed, gently, like a flag folded tight and handed to someone with shaking hands. And that was the twist. He didn't just deny Trump, he denied the entire performance. The stage, the audience, the need for approval. He spoke into silence and in doing so reminded everyone that some truths aren't shouted, they're stood beside. The wind returned, brushing against the flags. A leaf tumbled near the base of the wall. Somewhere someone cried softly, not out of sadness but recognition. In 7 words, Harrison Ford had shifted the weight of the moment. And no one watching would ever forget how it felt when the noise stopped and something real took its place. Trump stepped back, not dramatically, not defiantly, just back, a half step at first, then another. The weight of the moment no longer held by him, the eyes that once tracked his every move now anchored elsewhere. He glanced toward the crowd, but there was no applause waiting, no grateful nods, no performative smiles, only faces, still, quiet, watching something else. Harrison Ford hadn't moved again. After speaking, he had returned to silence, letting his hand linger over the name carved into stone, letting the gravity of the moment hold its shape without rushing to leave it behind. He stood for a few more seconds, long enough for the wind to lift gently, long enough for someone near the edge of the memorial to lower their camera and simply place it on the ground. Then slowly, he took a step back. Another. His hand dropped gently to his side, not as a symbol but as a release. The kind of movement that happens when something internal is resolved. He didn't glance at the crowd. He didn't nod. He didn't wait to be acknowledged. He just turned. The gravel under his boots shifted slightly, the soft scrape somehow louder than any voice that had filled the plaza that morning. He walked with purpose but not urgency, a man not leaving a stage but departing a memory, each step measured, each breath steady. No one blocked his path. No security detail, no staff, no press with microphones extended. He moved through the crowd the way one might walk through fog, present but untouchable. And as he passed, people didn't part like fans or followers. They stood, straighter, quieter, learning almost by instinct how to carry stillness. Near the far end of the wall, just before the path bent toward the trees, Ford paused. He turned back, not to look at the cameras or the president, but to face the granite one last time. With 2 fingers, he reached out and touched the edge of the stone. A simple gesture, no words, no sound, just contact, like sealing something shut, like leaving something behind that didn't belong to him but had passed through him for a moment. Behind him, a young officer in dress blues had come to attention. Her uniform was crisp, her chin high, her hands perfectly aligned behind her back. She did not speak. She did not salute. She just stood, not in reverence to Ford, but in recognition of what he stood for. A few feet away, a junior correspondent, no more than 25, whispered to the senior producer beside him. He didn't win the moment, he said. He became the moment. The producer said nothing, just nodded once and let the headset slide from his ears. All around, the crowd remained still. No one clapped, no one cheered. There was no anthem, no flag wave, no final word. And yet no one moved, because something had shifted, not in the man who walked away, but in the people he left behind. They had come for a ceremony. They were leaving with a standard. A woman in a wheelchair placed her hand over her heart. 2 teenagers stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes wide, phones forgotten in their pockets. A father quietly lifted his son and pointed toward the path where Ford had disappeared beyond the trees. The boy asked nothing. He understood. Trump remained off to the side, arms loose, expression unreadable. His presence, once overwhelming, now felt like background noise, not gone, but diminished. The spotlight had dimmed not because someone had stolen it, but because it had nothing left to illuminate. Ford never looked back. He didn't need to, because the moment wasn't his to keep. It belonged to someone else, to the name on the wall, to the hundreds of thousands whose names would never be spoken on television, whose stories would never trend, whose silence stretched far deeper than any one man's words could reach. And so, with gravel underfoot and memory at his back, Harrison Ford walked away, not as a symbol, not as a star, just as a man who showed up stood still and let silence speak for the ones who could not. And in his absence, the silence held. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.